Hello and a warm welcome to another episode. My guest today is Frank Piotraschke, former Senior Director Sales EMEA at Optimizely, Senior Vice President Global Sales at Staffbase, and now Chief Revenue Officer at SoSafe. Together we are talking about a revenue organization that you won't regret, what kind of metrics you should apply, and of course we are talking about compensation plans. Welcome, Frank. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hey Björn, good to talk to you. Thanks for the invitation.
I dare to say we have a lot in common. So we started in sales and now you became one of the revenue leaders. So and you said, so the core is sales, and then of course you're adding marketing further in the customer's journey, and then customer success expansion. So topic for today is how to set up a rev org which you won't regret. And I'm super curious and happy to have you around. So I would say let's jump into it and the compressed learnings of how to set up an org structure like this.
Happy to talk. Where do you want to start? Because I think sort of if I look at my story, obviously, I mean, if you look at the different functions of revenue, every function in itself, if you look into marketing, sales, or customer success, or whatever you want to add to this, things there are the most crucial one. And I think one of the advantages that we have in revenue organizations is, at least sort of from the leadership side, you bring all the dimensions together, which is usually not working, right? So we know all the stories from sales, how much they appreciate their colleagues in marketing, and the other way around. I guess similar goes it into sort of the success side of the business, right? Where sales always say, success is not really doing a lot the day, and success is always complaining about the sales folks that they bring all the bad revenue, right? So that they have to sort of maybe sort it out on the other side. Where do you want to start? Because I think usually the motion starts in sales, right? So that's usually where some of the early stage startups would start.
Then let's give you some background what I learned, because I started in sales as well, and I was also in charge of customer success. And looking backwards, I would say if we would have aligned more with marketing before, and if we would have aligned with product later, or basically it's the second layer, we would have been even more successful. So looking at your resume, so you worked kind of in the silo with quotation marks sales, and then you iterated over time into the revenue perspective. So maybe to start with, what was the crucial learning that you said, okay, the next position or my personal development was not just sales, but I really became a revenue leader?
That's a good question. And I would say over the course of my career, I always try to have a very close connection to marketing. Because, you know, with sales and customer success, it always feels like, I don't know, to use a metaphor, if you go for a drink, you go with a good friend, right? So it's sort of two people are very close to each other. And if marketing joins, it's a little bit like the guy that sometimes shows up, but it's not really around, right? So I felt like always as a sales leader, I try to have a close relationship to my friends in marketing, knowing that it's a little bit of a different crowd, knowing that it's a little bit of a different motion over there. Because once you understand, you're basically sort of working in the same revenue generating function, right? So it's basically just one step earlier, and the more you work together, the more it works. And even as a sales leader, I think I learned at some stage, it's better to have a good connection over there, understand what's important for them, and also have this feedback loop going. And this sometimes worked and sometimes it didn't, to be totally frank, right? So I had like great collaborations with marketing, then really sort of that storytelling went very well, continued in sales, you could close customers on a nice sort of trajectory. And on the other side, if this relationship doesn't work, you really sort of have more problems than you can think about. And therefore, once I sort of would say mastered maybe sort of the sales leadership function, went into the next role, I could see a lot of use or a lot of sense in combining the revenue function from marketing to CS, because basically what you do, you basically sort of control this one revenue generating function in a SaaS organization, right? So where we have everything digitized and you can really track end to end.
Then let's dive into it, because my assumption and also my belief is that at the very end, it's all about alignment and align the right KPIs and metrics along
Yes.
the entire customer journey. So what's your picture on that?
I agree, and the hardest thing, especially when I look at what we did here at SoSafe, but also probably to some extent what I did at Staffbase before, is to get basically one currency established in the revenue function, so that you get a common understanding of what matters. Because in marketing, many people think MQLs are a great thing. And yeah, I see you laughing. And in sales, you don't think so much, right? So you think more in opportunity values and in okay, how much sort of is really sort of in really sort of qualified business. And if you extend that, sort of this changes again. So at least sort of on that setup between marketing and sales, I insisted on sales accepted opportunity value, so SAO value, as a common currency. And you still have our friends in the middle, which are the SDRs usually, or BDRs, depending how you call them, and they usually also have another currency. And I try to bring all that together with this SAO value that I'm trying to set as a target in marketing, in SDR world as well, and as an acceptance criteria also on the sales side. And that creates a common perspective on the revenue generation. And then you can start sort of manipulating these, right? So where do they come from? How much are we generating in inbound and outbound, and maybe even partnerships, maybe to bring the CS folks into the mix through upsells if you have that already going. But you have this one thing, the pipeline that we call it, that works in similar ways. And then you overcome the problem that you may have when marketing is probably generating a lot of MQLs, maybe even hitting their MQL targets, but then at the next step, you don't really see the SAO value. So this is, for me, always the first step to get sort of a common value setting in place so that you don't measure different things.
It's the pipeline value contributed by channel, so basically marketing,
Yes.
SDRs, partnerships, etc.
And that sounds so easy.
It's
Right, so
super.
you just do it, right? So you just said it, but as you know, you walk into many pushbacks, right? So it took me quite some time to convince the marketing friends that this is a good thing to do.
Yeah.
And it's not sort of limiting their capabilities to be creative. They usually tend to not want to go too much towards the sales direction because they think we can probably easier sort of work on the MQL side. But it creates a lot of friction if you don't, at least sort of, I think so. And that's where I think the biggest proportion is that you have to convince people that this is the right move. We needed to convince people, we needed to try it out to see what happens. Also, in the beginning, we didn't do it, and we ended up with a lot of conversations, discussions, you could argue disputes between the different functions where some departments high-fived each other for hitting their targets, and then the next department, in this case sales, and well, that's great, but what should we do with it, right? So because there's a lot of junk in it, the quality was not clear, and that's what I usually would recommend also early on, right? So you don't need to have like 20 people in marketing and 100 people in sales to do this, right? This also could work with, let's say, 5 people in sales, 2 SDRs, and 2 or 3 folks in marketing. The logic can be set up already quite early. And the sooner you do it, the more you generate data that can be comparable later on.
And we're also talking about the org structure, because my take on it, it's one thing is, of course, the structure, and we'll come to this in a second. The other thing is, and I sensed it, what you just explained, is also the mindset and the way of cooperating, having shared goals, and really, you call it a dispute, and there should be friction. So often I see this kind of happy culture, and there was over the last years, there was, everything is growing and everyone is growing and blah, blah, blah. At the very end, it comes to numbers, and I see you smiling. So what's your take on how to build up the structure, whether it's a pod or kind of different departments? So how do you do it?
So it depends where you are, obviously, and also depends what kind of product you have, what is sort of the market that you're selling into. I was usually working in, let's say, sales-led organizations, in sales organizations that were more enterprise-driven, so selling bigger tickets to in the B2B world. SoSafe today is more sort of a mixed bag. So we're selling into also the mid-market a lot. We have many deals in sort of the mid-tier section. So it's a little bit different, but still I would call it sales-led. And in this regard, you usually start from the sales side, and you usually start with a handful of people, and then the other people come to the mix, right? So at some stage. So I would always recommend earlier than later to have the SDR AE motion going. That's at least what I learned. I walked into many different companies and they didn't have that. So it maybe sounds too obvious for now, but as a recommendation, I think sort of the shared responsibility in sales is a good starting point to build the org from that. Because if you have an SDR, or let's say an SDR function, this is already half the marketing. In some US companies, you will find SDRs or BDRs on the marketing side. And I think there is arguments why they sometimes tend to be on that side. And if you build marketing from that end, so adding one step earlier, right? So you start then from marketing, demand generation, which are the right channels? Do we do more inbound? Do we have to support SDRs with outbound material? What is working? What is sticking? Are we more a Google paid, a content company? Are we finding our customers more on the LinkedIn's or other places in the world? So you expand on that side, but as long as you sort of keep the let's say the SEO value as something that everybody understands they have to sort of optimize, it's a good conversation. But yes, this needed to be sort of explained. And when I took the revenue here, we were already past that, right? So we couldn't build it from the ground up like this. We had already a pretty good marketing department going, and I needed to convince them first that this is a good place where we can come together. Because we had these frictions, right? So that we were generating something on one side, and then the other side was not understanding what they should do with it.
So many questions, and thanks a lot. So let's dive into more detail. So if aligning SDRs and account executive, and we said already, sooner or later we will touch compensation with kind of target alignment. So what is the current setup, or what is kind of best practice in setting up targets for SDRs? Is it just pipeline created? Because my fear would be, depending on the sales motion and the sales cycle, this takes quite long, or at least for onboarding, it's not the perfect metric. You're also smiling. That's a relief. So how do you, so the will be clear, but how do you manage onboarding?
So try to understand what you mean with onboarding. But I think sort of how I usually set it up, and what I believe works best also here, to stick to the pipeline value. The pushback that you receive when you do that is that exactly what you just say. The SDRs will say, how should we define the value early on? We only have a meeting that somebody booked. How can we define value? The AE probably has to, in a 4I principle, then to adjust the value that the SDR sort of suggested. It would be so much easier if we would just compensate or set as a target on meetings booked, or demos booked, whatever sort of the next step would be. I still think that the more you stick sort of to the pipeline target, the more sort of you can do it sort of across the board. And if you started with marketing, and you already sort of say, okay, yeah, it's delayed. So in marketing, you generate something that is happening later, and you sort of retroactively measure it. It's still sort of the same value that you're trying sort of to influence. And this also goes for the SDR. I'd always say sort of for the SDRs to compensate for them for something that is very close to them. And I think the value can be sort of analyzed and set also from the SDR already. And as long as sort of there is a good AE SDR connection happening, usually the value stays. It's not deviating rapidly, at least not in the companies that I worked for. You can usually see sort of a 10 to 20% melt from the SDR value that is set to sort of the accepted and probably the closed value. And that's something I'd say I can live with very well. If it deviates too much, which usually happens in more immature organizations early on, because AEs tend to accept everything that is brought along. As SDRs will realize that very quickly. They will generate a lot of pipeline that maybe hasn't reached the level already that you should have. So, but I think this is something that you can work on and optimize once you set it. And then you have sort of this whole motion going that everybody works on the same thing.
Okay, yeah. So I think there are two important components. A, maturity of the overall sales process or the overall organization in really having a common understanding and a clear understanding between what is my deal or opportunity value. The other thing is what I meant with onboarding. It could work for the first 3 to 6 months that you have a split, or for the 3 months you are just looking at the pure numbers of appointments set, depending on how fast you will get a proper value, and also depending on the maturity. That was
you meaning in the early start of an SDR organization. Exactly. When you started out.
Exactly.
Fair point. You could argue that. On the other hand, you could also argue that sort of you can even ramp also SDRs on lower pipeline contributions over time, because I think also that to me it's very much also a muscle that every individual SDR needs to build, but also the organization needs to build. You need to understand it, how it works. You obviously need to provide playbooks and guidelines so that people understand what is sort of what they have to do and how you do it. What are the questions that need to be asked? How do you set the value? What is an AE doing once they receive it? What is the handover? What are the things that have to be contributed? An SDR is usually somebody that, just very briefly before worked something very simple, or was in a university, or usually there's job starters. You need to educate them along the way on these things.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's kind of, you call it a muscle, whether you call it a muscle or a mindset or both. Either way, it's kind of the common denominator or the common metric for success is pipeline contribution, and later on it's closed deal value. So which brings me to the second component of the bow tie. I'm a huge fan of the bow tie. So once a deal is closed, we still have kind of a lot of alignment to be mastered. So what are the kind of the biggest takes in there and the learnings?
Also here, I think sort of the CS organization, so if you continue sort of once you close a deal, and obviously sort of the more you sort of generate traction there as well, the more sophisticated you also become on that end. And I can see that very much also on all the places that I've been basically. So in the beginning, every CS function, and I know people will probably hate me for saying that, but the beginning of, I think, every CS function is tech support, right? So it's more sort of it's onboarding, helping people getting into the solution that you have, and then you try sort of to technically support them. And also this maturity grows over time. So in the beginning, you don't have to try to retain customers, because usually, depending on the model that you're in, you have at least a year or maybe a little longer until sort of, all the customers that you start to generate will have to be retained at some stage. But this will be then the first exercise. All of a sudden, customers have to be retained. So you start with logo retention that you're really sort of trying to avoid or maximize out. And I think over time, you change to GRR, right? So gross retention, and then you sort of, I think the mastering of it is when you get more sort of to either combination of GRR and NRR, or only focusing on NRR depending on the number of customers that you're trying to retain. And I think sort of there it also becomes, if you are venture driven, these numbers will be first and last in every deck, right? So what is the GRR, and more even importantly, the NRR number that you're trying sort of to do, and also sort of to have the trajectory, right? So it's okay in the beginning if you're struggling a little bit on the retention, but after some time, in year 2, 3, 4, you should probably be better there. And that's also, I think, the time you have to set up your CS, and also to establish here something of a collaboration, right? So to overcome the initial always complaints, you bring all the customers, we cannot retain them because they were promised something else. You're struggling a little bit with the setup, and then after some time, you establish sort of a little bit better collaboration. You move also out of the tech support and more really into the key accounting success motion, and then other things start to happen. You build also their muscle, which is called upsells. So all of a sudden, you even sort of get more distinctive in, okay, upsells is not just that. We maybe have seat expansions. We have like package expansions. These are different things. I have to probably tackle them from different ends. If I'm a customer success manager, you may have, even in the success game, success managers that are working more for bulk accounts where you have like smaller bags or pockets of business, and then you have more the enterprise side where you're trying sort of to work yourself into bigger accounts. So this is then also the leveling up that you do on that end.
I'm super intrigued. So this is kind of maybe a very nerdy question, but nevertheless, I will give it a try. How obsessed are you about the level of detail? For example, let's pick a marketing campaign, which is then or marketing campaign and or account-based marketing. Then it's closed by sales, and then you see an outstanding NRR later on. So what is kind of the level which is practical in your sense? And what kind of level of experience do you have in these kind of next level alignment of revenue?
So you're asking how much are we wondering where the good revenue comes from?
Exactly, and how to align marketing, sales, and customer success on either cohort, segment level, or any other common denominator.
So I'd say in the beginning, you don't care, right? So in the beginning, you just go and you
Yes.
try sort of to hit every quarter, because with every quarter, we all know we earn the right to do the next one. I keep saying that I think the average duration of a VP sales is 18 months, right? So that's what I'm trying to give as a feedback to everybody that starts, earn from quarter to quarter. And the more you get sophisticated, the more you add. And what you can do early on, when you have done it once or twice, then you know if you're good and if you're lucky, the combination of the two, you get to the place where these things matter. And you also know if you set a few things up in the beginning, it's so much easier in the end sort of to analyze these things. So coming back to your question, is that interesting for us? Yes, probably we start a little earlier, and we start not really with which campaign yielded which customers, but more which channel, right? So you start with, is outbound really sort of less good than marketing? Are sort of the hand raiser marketing guys better than the ones that you have to sort of win over a couple of different touch points? So these questions will be sort of more first and foremost, but even for that, you need a proper CRM setup in the beginning. And usually, in almost all my jobs that I did, I had to change that at some stage. And usually, you change it from something to Salesforce, and something could be HubSpot, it could be Pipedrive, it could be even be Dynamics at some stage. Not any criticism to these companies, but I think most mature sales organizations will go on a Salesforce organization sooner than later, and then it starts to sort of matter, right? So how do you set it up in the beginning? When did you do this shift? So you can answer the questions that you just raised, because I think they're important. The more you mature it, but I'd rather say you start with the channels first, and then you go, okay, if we look at inbound, can I look a little bit deeper? Is it events maybe? Is it maybe more paid campaigns, whatever?
Yeah, so I think it's also the kind of the sweet spot about in an ideal world, and is it practical, and is it fitting to the current situation of the company, and of course the CRM. I think they're quite good chance to get at least something out of HubSpot. I think they're doing a good job. Pipedrive, there are definitely some limits, as I can tell. Let's touch the last big topic. So when we look at this, and this is useful either at least to check on channel level. When it comes to compensation, and I know I'm fascinated by the at least in my little bubble, the current discussion about what is personal commission for sales, and how can marketing contribute, what is target setting for customer success, expansion, etc. I'm super curious, how did you solve it as of now? And if you would restart, what would you potentially do differently?
So I'm coming from a world from, in university, I tried to wrap my head around sort of compensation and compensation models, and that usually like individual compensation models don't trigger motivation. And then I ended up in sales and realized, they all didn't read the same thing that I did when I studied. And I had to realize and I learned probably that also not the hard way, actually sort of the eye-opening way, when I was working for an American company, that there is in sales just this ingredient of individual compensation. I cannot say that I inherently a big fan of it, but I realized across the time of my career, and I'm very open to learn how it can be organized in a different way. But this is sort of the key component of sales remuneration, that you have this individual compensation piece. And I tried a couple of times in my life sort of team compensations. It never worked. So I still have a setup of individual sales compensation that are basically sort of locked into ARR contribution. And then you obviously in the compensation, you're a little bit differently organized on the SDR side. Here I would compensate for pipeline contribution, usually sort of as a value on a month. On an AE contribution, usually more gravitate towards quality compensation models. Also on ARR contribution, if you look into marketing, I didn't find, and would really keen to hear your side, any way to have bigger proportions going on variable income components. Usually that's not working very well because people don't appreciate it too much. Because also probably they haven't seen the good side of it. Usually they only know the bad stories about it.
Yeah.
And to some extent that also is the same for customer success. Here it's a little bit easier because you have more tangible numbers like GRR, NRR. You can really crunch these down also to individual portfolios that a CS person might have. But also here you would usually probably not go beyond of 20% of a remuneration package or so.
Yeah, it's super fascinating, and I did exactly the same journey. So I did a lot of reading in university, then I did a lot of kind of leadership practice, I digged into recent research. Everyone is telling the same story, kind of extrinsic motivation flattens out, and digging or sales-led is an entirely different world. So I'm super curious, and there are some examples, for example, Frontify here in Switzerland, they kind of at least scaled to 10 million ARR without any personal commission. There are other kind of from ground zero startups where they defined for the entire company a 10% up to a 20% bonus if they reach their overall company targets. And everyone is just paid with a base salary. And no one is caring whether he or she is working in marketing, sales, customer success, or any other function. So this is kind of and beyond. So this is the range I'm familiar with. What is also based on, I would say, data available is a fact that in fast scaling environment, money helps for at least midterm. Is it sustainable? That's a different topic, but at least this is kind of proven with some data that money in sales with a high personal bonus helps scaling.
I think also there's a couple of, and I'm super interested sort of to learn more a little bit about the examples, because I also read in my university studies about Hatzberg and all sort of the different studies and how you motivate people. And I'm usually a huge fan of intrinsic motivation and no sort of extrinsic motivation is usually sort of like, how do you say, short calories or sort of sugar calories, right? So it's something that wears off very quickly.
Low quality carbs.
Yes. Unfortunately, I'm also a fan of those, but that's another story. But I get it, right? So, but at the same time, we're maneuvering in a market where we know, even at the size of SoSafe today, right? So we are reaching the 400 people mark. We're growing super aggressively at the moment. You operate in a marketplace. You are not just for yourself. So either you do that, what we do here, we believe in young professionals that we can educate, that we can teach also on the sales side. We don't need sort of the veteran enterprise sales folks that have been in big corporations that you also have to chip out a lot of money for. Not to say that sort of our folks here are not well compensated, but you know what I mean, right? So yeah. you more also believe in an SDR can become an AE when in the same organization after some time. You let people grow, but even if you maybe in the beginning you're fine with sort of giving them a good base salary and don't give them any add-on or too big add-on, they will learn at other places they do. And I cannot sort of blame them too much if they will fall for that, right? So because there is places as salespersons where we all know you can earn a lot of money. And that's a reality in the business, I think. And if you're even on the other side where you say, okay, my product requires people that have done it before, I have to do tenders, I have to do sort of very complicated sales motions, so I buy time in the meaning that I trying to get veterans or people that have done it before. We all know that it's very hard sort of to win somebody that has sort of, been involved with these kind of sort of packages and how you sort of compensate there. So I struggle because I've usually been in environments that are growing very, very fast. How can I educate the marketplace, right? So because I tend to think I don't have the time for that.
Yeah. And it's absolutely fair point. So that's why. So if you're competing with other in the market, which we do, then you have. I think there's just one way out. So a very super strong vision, super strong culture, and you're going all in, accepting that you won't get all the talent available, which is scarce over time, overall. There are a few examples. I will have another episode dealing with this and the more philosophical way about the motivation piece. But I think there is no right truth, but it's cool to hear that you're at least thinking in the same direction. Is there an alternative to the current setup, which is and was working very, very well for you? So,
I'd say, if I just may sort of answer very quickly on that, I'd say also it depends on maturity of the company. I'd say sort of if you're smaller, if you're like 50 to 100 people, I think you can sort of find your way around that. I would probably argue the sooner sort of you're growing and you're becoming sort of something else, a little bit bigger, probably past the 10 million ARR mark, that is where it becomes more and more difficult. Because also we probably have to admit at some stage, it's fair when people think this is a job, this is not a religion. Even though it's a startup and we all have a vision, we want to change something, it's still sort of a job for people. And I think that's fair when then they start comparing what they have here, what they would have in other places.
Yeah. And I would totally agree, and there's a great closing remark. So we could continue for ages, at least from my side. So it was really refreshing in a short while. So summarizing from my side, so what I learn? So you call it a muscle, whether it's a muscle or a mindset. So the one key piece of building a rev org is that alignment of metrics, and the marketing sales alignment is driven by pipeline contribution and value. Ideally on channel, and then you can go crazy at some point. And after closing, then it's a GRR or NRR, which with that, you have a very solid base to have a proper conversation with all the participants and stakeholders. Would that be a right summary?
I agree. And maybe to add on that, the more you grow, the more you can distinct it, right? So you may have a pipeline contribution from marketing first, and then you can also break it down here into departments, in contributing factors. You can have sub-targets, and you make it more sophisticated. You start with something big, and then you sort of break it out. No, good summary.
It was a pleasure, Frank, and all the best. And my sense is we will meet shortly again. And
happy to do so. Enjoy the conversation.